Well, let's get into dogme now, because we've already segued very nicely there. So I think we should talk about Leo van Lier, author of The
Please.
Ecology and Semiotics of Language Learning, Interaction in the Language Curriculum. And you've mentioned this many times, Scott, that he was a very, along with Neil, very important influence in your development. And you kind of quote him as a spirit guide for you. You mentioned that his books
Oh.
are heavily underlined and annotated, and you even know whole extracts by heart. Yes, it's right there. And one of the things I've noticed, and you've mentioned this, is, and Mike and I have only recently, maybe in the last 2 years, have been deep, kind of like emerging, not emerging, but a lot of his work has emerged naturally for us. And for according to you, he connected some of those important dots and moved TESOL beyond the confines of the classroom towards this universe and this idea of ecolinguistics, emergence, affordance, social cultural learning theory, scaffolding, just to name a few. One of the first questions we have is with regards to ecolinguistics, emergence, affordances, social cultural learning theory, scaffolding. Can you tell us more about how your past experiences and the work of Van Lier influenced the entire Dogme ELT movement, teaching unplugged, I should say?
Well, how long have you got? I mean, let me just say, I read uh, as few books that make such an impression that you remember exactly when you first started reading and where you were. And I was in the airport of Palma de Mallorca coming back from observing a teacher or whatever.
Mm.
And I was reading, got the book and I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. And I remember that vividly. And I subsequently met Leo on a couple of occasions, once in Brazil, in fact, and the second time in Northern Cyprus. And we spent some considerable time talking. But one of the things about him comes through his book is his kind of his, as you say, it's kind of almost like a Renaissance capacity to bring in lots of feeder disciplines that you didn't think had anything to do with English language teaching. And he was also one of the first people who started to kind of challenge the reigning paradigm, which is still with us, which is that the language learning happens in the head and only in the head. You know, it's the cognitive, the brain as a computer kind of metaphor, which is still with us very much, but has been shaken to its foundations by people like Leo van Lier, by Diane Larson Freeman, and in his own time by Orl Stevik too. And so what Van Lier brought into the equation was very much this the ecolinguistics, but also just interaction, the role of interaction in learning and in the classroom. And of course, this hails back to Vygotsky and social cultural theory, which was also a new kid on the block. I mean, it hadn't been, it's been around since the 1930s, but it had never permeated the West because it was tainted with Marxist connotations. And
Right.
I remember a woman on my teacher training on a Delta course saying, "Haven't you heard of Vygotsky? Everything you're doing is very Vygotsky-esque." No. And so that got me really interested. And so Van Lier, of course, takes that on board, and he takes ecolinguistics on board, and he takes dynamic learning theory on board, and he kind of forges this thing, but it's grounded in his basic. Now, his first book, even before Interaction and Language Curriculum, was all about classroom, teacher discourse, etc. And so it's this notion that, yes, it's the interactions. That's where learning takes place, is the interaction between the teacher and the learner, but also between the learners themselves. And that's all it needs. It doesn't need to be mediated by course books or, CD-ROMs or, online games or whatever. It's the interaction. It's in the interaction. And so his book just nailed that for me. And this is what I thought, this is what we're trying to do on our courses, is to focus on this interaction and the richness and the quality of the interaction. And so it was an easy progression to Dogma. I mean, he planted the seeds. It wasn't the only one, but I mean, definitely, when did this book come out? 1996. Yeah. It was, so the notion, and then subsequently in the 2004 book on ecology, ecolinguistics, and semiotics, which is a harder book.
Yes.
But
yes, indeed, very
good
hard
one.
to
read. He's got so much going on in his head. I think he had trouble. He never was faced by a blank page because it was the opposite. It was just too much to go onto the page. He didn't know how to kind of edit himself. But But it was absolutely fascinating, and the idea that that language learning can emerge out of activity. I mean, and I saw one, I think his talk I saw him given in Brazil was about activity-based learning, which was just another word for task-based learning, really. And so again, Dewey-esque experiential learning, but learning can, with the right kind of scaffolding and the right degree of attention and engagement, can emerge, keyword, out of activity with language. And so that's the job of the teacher, is to create, and this was the communicative approach after all, you know, like I said, you learn a language by using it. And this is what Dick Allwright was saying in 1976, and they were all saying, and nobody followed through, except the kind of, it went off down the task-based avenue, or content-based learning, and all the other kind of permutations of more semantic syllabus, etc. So, so this came at exactly the right time. I read all these, you know, these books that really fell into my lap and changed my thinking radically, or confirmed my thinking, or made me articulate it. And so when that just happened, I was in a cinema in Barcelona watching a film, an oddball film by a Scandinavian film, and they had this little flyer that they handed out, and they said, this is a film about the Dogma 1995 film movement, and these are the 10 vows of the Dogma. If to make a Dogma film, you had to you had to obey these 10 vows. And I looked at this and I thought, well, this is fun. I could write a little article about this, and say this is what we're trying to do in English language teaching. We need to abandon as you know, or we need to rescue language. This is what the Dogma film movement, they kept saying, we're trying to rescue filmmaking. We're trying to recreate the joy of filmmaking that we had when we made our first films. And so I said, yeah, we need to rescue English language teaching. We need to find the joy of English language teaching again, and not turn it into this chore. And so I wrote that little 1-page, 2-page article for the IATEFL Issues in 2005.
It's interesting because I was reading recently.
2000. Yeah, go on.
No, I was just reading because, I mean, there are a lot of similarities. When you look at Van Lier's AAA curriculum and you read Teaching Unplugged, the two share strikingly similar teaching philosophies and practices. And as you said, you've admitted that Van Lier was an important influence. And again, this concept of instructional conversation and all that. But I would like us to focus on the autonomy, the authenticity, and awareness, because I wanted to know if the autonomy relates to the conversation driven, because there's a quote by Van Lier, and I have the page here, page 193. He says, language education is enhanced by things such as engagement, intrinsic motivation, self-determination, and that these conditions are promoted by certain kinds of social interaction. And when I think about Teaching Unplugged, you said conversation in the real world, at least, is not so much transactional as interactional. That is, when we chat with a friend, it's not normally the exchange of information that is the main purpose. So would you say that the autonomy relates to the conversation driven in that way?
Well, I think I have a talk called 7 Things Beginning with A, and because it seems to me
you also have one with R as well.
Yes. Well, that was when after I wrote the A to Z of ELT, I needed a catchy title for talks. And one of the things about writing the A to Z of the ELT is you are writing it in alphabetical order, and you start to see connections that wouldn't normally be there because you're doing all the A's together and all the R's together. But there's some very rich A words, including autonomy and appropriation, of course, the Vygotskian idea, and also authenticity and agency. And actually, I think agency is the kind of one I'm more committed to rather than autonomy, but it's giving the learners agency, giving them some say in the direction of the lesson. There was a very good article that Rod Ellis wrote years ago, which has disappeared from trace. It's never been reprinted, but we used to use it in our Delta course. And it was all about discourse ownership in the language lesson. And it's this, I said, yes, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to give ownership to, and some of the best lessons I had observed when the teacher didn't abdicate their responsibility, but devolved responsibility onto the learners, but was always there supporting, scaffolding, being the teacher, but allowing the learners to run with the content of the lesson, if you like. And so this seems to be really exciting. And this is a very Van Lier idea. I mean, I think, you know, autonomy is the ultimate goal, of course, of any educational process, is that the learners shouldn't be relying on the teacher to be there holding them up and providing that kind of support. But it's a goal. I'm not sure how much autonomy you can actually have in the process of learning. I need to go back and look at Van Lier again, what he says about that. And also authenticity, of course, authenticity not of the materials necessarily, but authenticity of the discourse, you know, that it is grounded in the concerns of the people in the room.
So that connects to the materials light, because Van Lier says, and again, I think it's page 95, the raw material for awareness raising is to be found all around the student in the real world, rather than between the covers of a textbook. And that when I read that, I automatically link that to materials light with
well, exactly. And if you remember our mission statement, if you like, when we'd started the discussion group, the Yahoo discussion group, post that article I wrote in IATEFL Issues, when people like Luke got in touch with me and we started talking, and somebody said, why don't we have these things called discussion groups? So we did. And the mission statement, if you like, said we're committed to I can't remember, something like a teaching of bare essentials, using the raw material of the classroom interaction to create language learning affordances, something like that. So it was very, very, it was grounded in that rhetoric, which comes straight from Van Lier.
Right.
And I don't think, I do wonder if he ever heard about, I didn't, because, I mean, this was the problem in those days. I mean, the Atlantic schism. I mean, there was people doing stuff in the States and Canada on the one hand, and people doing stuff in Europe and Britain on the other, and never the twain really met. And I think that was because it was practitioners. It wasn't at the level of academics or research necessarily. So when I did meet and had a chance to talk to Van Lier at length, I'm not even sure that I probably even mentioned dogma, because I was a little bit ashamed of it, because it hadn't been validated by the academic community. And it still hasn't.
I was going to say that. Has it been? Or no, it hasn't.
Well, it pops up now. People who write about task-based learning are mentioning it in passing, because it's a kind of manifestation of materials like task-based learning. And interestingly enough, I wonder if I'm allowed to say this. Well, I better not. But two people who are very much at the cutting edge of theorizing and researching task-based learning, of producing a book shortly, and the last chapter of which they're looking at kind of variations of task-based learning. And I'm being interviewed next week by one of the co-authors about dogma exactly, and how it. And in fact, I was invited to a conference about 10 years ago in New Zealand. It's the biannual task-based learning conference, and all the heavies of task-based learning are there, including Rod Ellis, of course. And I was asked to give a plenary, and I said, "Why are you asking me? This is unresearched." And they said, "No, dogma. Talk about teaching unplugged." And I said, I think they thought because I was in New Zealand, I was just down the road, and it would save on costs. They didn't realize that I lived in Spain, and they had to fly me all the way halfway around the world.
Maybe this is a good time to jump in with this question, Leo, because Scott, when Leo interviewed Luke near the end of last year, Luke was reminiscing and talking about that famous session that the two of you gave at the IH conference, and he was talking about his feelings before kind of going out to do the session. I think I'm correct in saying he was a bit nervous that you didn't really know how it was going to go. I was wondering if you could talk us through the moments before you went out there and then the reaction to that session.
Well, there were two sessions, or at least two, where one was at IATEFL. I remember we were driving down to Brighton, and he kept saying, "Shouldn't we, and I said, don't worry about it." And I'm not sure if that was the Manic Street Teachers session. We also had Graham Hall on one. There was four of us: Luke, me, Graham Hall, and the guy from Poland, who was also one of the early people on the discussion. And it was so male-dominated when you think back to it. But somebody called us the Manic Street Teachers after the name of the.
Nice.
And that was a kind of free-for-all with people like Alan Maley being quite critical in the audience, and Lenny Dam, who, the Danish, she's highly into learner autonomy, and she felt we were being irresponsible because we were saying, planning, schmanning, and we weren't really, but we were being provocative. But no, the best occasion was the launch of Teaching Unplugged, which is also at an IATEFL conference. I don't know if that was the session that Luke was referencing, but we had a plan. Comes back to this thing about of planning and preparedness. But it was the end of a day. It was the launch. It was the book had just come out, and we were surprised to see how many people were in the room. It was absolutely packed.
Right.
And I said to Luke, listen, we'll just start off. You know how normally a talk, you do the talk and then you have question and answer. I said, we're going to start with a question and answer, because people are here for a reason. They have questions. So let's start with the questions. So I said that we're going to start with the questions. And Mario Rinvolucri was in the audience. He shot up and he had a question. I can't remember what it was, but it was like we never got to the talk. We spent an hour dealing with the questions. And a woman came up to me afterwards to sign the book, and she said, I was just thinking about the session you just did. It's kind of quite dogma-esque, isn't it? And I said, yes, you got it. Yeah, it was. Got a loop input.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
Do you still view it as, maybe it wasn't then. I mean, is controversial the word? Was it just disruptive? Is it still disruptive. That? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's interesting. You should ask. I mean, there's a whole new sort of resurgence of interest in dogma. And I think there's a generation. I mean, you think about it's 20 years old. And people, most teachers started teaching long, and they had some kind of brush with it during their CELTA or Delta. And often people who did a Delta, that was they did it as their experimental practice. And I get a lot of feedback from people who come up to me at conference and say, oh yeah, I did my experimental practice lesson as dogma lesson, and it was real, seat of your pants, but it was really exciting, and it was fine. It was very, very positive about that. But because of this kind of generational thing, and also I suspect there's a sort of, it needs to be discovered again, because we are more inundated with materials and technology than ever. And I think the move, this being precipitated into online teaching or remote teaching, where nobody was ready for it. Well, not nobody, but a lot of us weren't ready for it. Really forced people to start rethinking about what's going on here, what is teaching, and maybe dogma offers something, because it's, and so I've been doing masses of talks and courses and things recently in the last year on dogma. I can't push it away. I mean, I started off in Moscow about 2 years ago. I was asked to do a weekend workshop, and they said dogma. And I thought, oh gosh, really, you really want that? And I did it. And it was intensive and very powerful, demanding, experienced teachers who had been doing more of it than I had ever done, really. I mean, these are people they really believed it. It was ideological. And it was an incredible experience. It was so intense, completely drained. But then we did it again. I did it again in Ukraine, something similar. And it was incredibly, and so I thought there's a real felt need for this. So
it's growing.
It's kind of, it's
growing
sort of
again.
Got a new lease of life.
Absolutely. And I've noticed that with now, especially because teachers are not working for schools anymore. A lot of teachers are teaching online. They're doing one-to-one, and they find that when you're teaching from a textbook and you're teaching one-to-one, it doesn't really work. And a lot of teachers have connected with us and have said, oh, can you guys tell us more about dogma? And very much like you, Scott, I've been teaching without textbooks for the last maybe 10 years of my life, and I would never go back to that. But there is something that you said, and I think this is how we kind of wrap up the dogma, and then we kind of like reach the end of our interview here. But Van Lier mentioned something about, which to me is very philosophical. It's almost like he's drinking on the fountains of Stoicism here. But he talks about this essential interconnectedness of autonomy, of authenticity, and awareness. And you and Meddings profess an attitude shift, a state of mind, a different way of thinking and being a teacher. Is dogma or teaching unplugged more like a mindset then, in your opinion?
Well, I've always argued it's not a method. I mean, and this is really being hypocritical, because in my latest book, 30 English Teaching Methods, I have a chapter on dogma. Like, Scott Thornbury says it's not a method, yet he puts it in his method book. Well, that's because, and that was because if I didn't put it in there, people would say, why not? That's the only reason we bought the book.
We'll make that quote the promo for the whole show. So there you go.
So we used to say, we trotted out this thing, it's not a method, it's a mindset. And I think we believe that it is a mind. I mean, it goes back to that quote, I think you sort of referenced it, that Claire Cramch said, talking about dialogic pedagogy, sort of post Paulo Freire, kind of how she said a dialogic pedagogy is another way of being a teacher. And I thought we think dogma is another way of being a teacher. It's actually, it's the way of being a teacher that most teachers actually become, with given enough experience. I mean, and the trajectory of teachers' professional lives, not just in language teaching, but across the board, shows that as teachers become more experienced, they become more focused on the learners. They allow more agency to the learners. They become less me kind of thing. And it's just it's something that so many teachers come and say, "Oh, dogma, I've been doing that for years." Yes, of course you have, because you're an experienced teacher and you're a reflective practitioner, and that's the direction. So it's not another way of being a teacher so much as of becoming the teacher that you really always wanted to be or needed to be. And so it is a mindset, but it's not a mindset. Sort of implies, it's like an overnight sort of, Paul on the way to Damascus kind of insight. It's not. It's really a growing awareness for most teachers that there is another way of being a teacher, and you do not need to slavishly follow through. Follow a course book or a grammatical syllabus, actually, which is the most pernicious of all sins.
Yeah. Wow.
No, that's the quote. That's the quote.
We'll use that one.